Welcome to another episode of the Energy Central Power Perspectives podcast, where we dive into the most pressing challenges and advancements in the utility and energy sectors. Today, we're thrilled to have a renowned expert and thought leader in the world of energy, Amy Myers Jaffe. Amy is a globally recognized expert on the geopolitics of energy, climate risks, sustainability, and so much more. As the director of the Energy, Climate Justice, and Sustainability Lab at NYU, Amy is pioneering discussions on energy security, resilience, and the intersection of new technologies with environmental policy. I'm Jason Price, your host, coming to you from New York City, and with me as always from Orlando, Florida, is Energy Central producer and community manager Matt Chester. Matt, when we talk geopolitics and energy, what areas of focus tend to resonate most with our Energy Central community?
Yeah, Jason. So while our Energy Central community, it's definitely focused largely on North America, both in terms of our membership and in the content. The world of energy and utilities today it's of course interconnected internationally more than ever before. So given that, we're seeing regular conversations on the platform that look into the international and geopolitical lenses of energy, whether that's technology sharing, trade agreements, the international politics associated with critical minerals, global conferences and agreements for decarbonization targets and financing, and then even the national security angle of each of these topics. So professionals in the energy sector these days, they don't have the luxury of thinking just in their localized, isolated manner, but this more geopolitical view really does permeate as a requirement now, and we're seeing that in the conversations on Energy Central.
That's right, Matt, and I think any of our listeners who share that focus will be hooked by today's discussion. Before we dive into today's episode, I do want to thank West Monroe, our sponsor of today's show. Now, Amy Myers Jaffe really is an expert whose knowledge is wide as it is deep, meaning we'll have the opportunity to talk about all the headline topics top of mind these days. And that includes AI, SMRs, and how the heck is the utility sector going to find a way to meet the never-ending demand growth on the grid. But let's not get too deep without our guest. So let's bring her in. Amy Myers Jaffe, welcome to the Energy Central Power Perspectives podcast.
Jason, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
As are we. Amy, I don't want to undersell your resume. Can you give our listeners a rundown of your history in the energy industry and your current post at NYU?
Well, Jason, I began my career actually as an energy journalist, writing about the oil industry. So that kind of put me into knowing the movers and the shakers pretty much all around the world. And from that, I moved to the university world and started writing about geopolitics and energy policy. Now at NYU, I'm much more focused on electricity innovation and markets, still with a geopolitical focus on electricity. I know a lot of your listeners don't think of electricity as being geopolitical, so we'll probably go down that rabbit hole a little bit together. But I've done some unusual things along the way. I was in California for a while, helping the state with its low carbon fuels policy. I served for a while as an advisor to the UC Regents Pension Fund, which is basically the largest pension and endowment fund in the country. They were trying to develop a sustainable investing framework, help the chief investment officer with that, and then help them sort of train people how to implement it. And then writing books. So you mentioned my book, Energy Digital Future. That was a major project done together with Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. And I've written in the past a book about why we keep having repeated oil price crises. Anyway, that's a little bit about me.
All right, fantastic. And we're thrilled to have you here because, we're just still digesting the outcome of the most recent election. So everything is really timely, and having you here is really timely. So since we're going to have new leadership or returned leadership to the White House in a few months, we want to see and get your perspective on how you see things from an energy policy and overall climate policy perspective.
Well, let me just say, in terms of being an intellectual, I think that's like a negative buzzword today. So let me just say, I spend a lot of time with the same kind of executives that listen to the show. I spend a lot of time with industry, a lot of time with practitioners. And one of the things I know from doing that is that the kinds of things we talk about in sound bites and political speech making are ones where when we start getting behind the curtain and we have to really think about how to reform the electricity system, say in the United States, to get more stable energy and to get more affordable energy, I can tell you that I don't think that just eliminating environmental policies is going to lower the cost of electricity in the United States. So, let's talk about that for a minute. I mean, I like the fact that J.D. Vance talked about the shortages in key equipment like transformers. That made me feel more confident that we're entering a new White House administration with people who understand the problems that we have in the sector. I believe that when you look at Biden policies and Trump policies, going back to 2016 and then looking forward, that our current administration, the Biden administration, in Trump 1.0 and definitely Trump 2.0, everybody understands the importance of winning the race globally to be the leaders in artificial intelligence and everything that goes with that. And we could talk a little bit about the consequences of the AI world on military and weaponry and so forth. But really, most importantly, because AI is going to be so central to our national security, then having a stable and secure electricity grid becomes a top priority. And that is not a straightforward task, as everybody in the industry knows. We have to be thinking about not just the way we have political dialogue today about what is the winning form of generation. Because in my opinion, the answer to that question, quite frankly, is location specific. It's not just renewables versus some other dirtier fuel. It's really about the broad range of solutions. And that, I've written a book. So digital solutions, how and where we're going to use AI, what transmission technologies we should be seeking out, and how would we implement them best, and what policy reform is needed. Do we need to change the way we do prices in this country? Is there a way to have data centers and cryptocurrency pay a higher wholesale price than residential low-income users, and how would we implement that? So those are the questions that I think we actually need to grapple with. And I look forward to discussing more about that with you as the show rolls on.
That's great. So, Amy, I want to ask you about the dynamics between the federal priorities and, of course, the state agendas on energy and climate goals. That's always an interesting dynamic, especially with Trump 1.0 and what we're anticipating on 2.0. So I'd love to get your perspective on that. So are we going to see the courts involved and the process gummed up, or do you think we'll see the continued momentum at the state level like we saw in Trump 1.0? Can you talk about that?
It's just pretty hard today, I think, to do anything without the courts getting involved when you're talking about any kind of infrastructure. So I think that that's a communications challenge. I think when the president comes back into office, he needs to talk directly to the American people about why energy infrastructure is important to national security and how sometimes we have to look beyond a local impact. And I think it's a tough sell. That's, problem number one. And then I think industry really needs to help policymakers understand what kind of technology is out there. When people come in to Congress, new Congress people and senators, and when we have a new administration, how many people are going to know what the word reconductoring means? And what are we really saying? What kind of materials are out there? What should be R&D and first-of-a-kind demonstrations? What is there that we really know works and we should be doing? And what is it that's blocking us from getting there? And what would it achieve in terms of more transmission and the right transmission and the stable transmission? And what's the role for federal dollars? I've been a little bit critical of DOE over this past year because I get it. They've approved and funded, a lot of great corridors, North Plains, Cross Tie, South Line, Cimarron. But is that really where we have the bottlenecks that are being created by data centers? Because I would argue that a lot of those projects, though they have a lot of merit, didn't actually address the national security problems that we have. And so I would hope that when the Trump administration comes in, they really sit down systematically with a map and say, Does Constellation need any help, right? I mean, is ERCOT where it needs to be, and really look at places where we have a tremendous amount of data centers already and possible more growth. Arizona was one place, maybe that project made sense, but we really need to be analytical, and we can't just be this, money out the door because I know a congressman, or money out the door because we're in a rush. I think there really needs to be a systematic national security deep dive on the whole grid nationally and where the best places are to spend federal dollars.
All right. Well, that's interesting. So let's talk about this a little bit further. You're basically giving a framework of what the incoming administration should be thinking about. Can you now prioritize? Like, what would be on your top 10 list of priorities that the administration should be thinking about, especially as it relates to, meeting growth and demand and growing load that we're seeing across the country?
I just say transmission, transmission, transmission. And when I say transmission, by that, I really don't mean just, like I said, are we having or not having national corridors? I really think we need to look at the whole range of technology and funding for that technology. How do we get utilities to spend the money to do more advanced materials or to use, some of these newfangled digital solutions that can help them move away from standardized line rating to more dynamic systems where we can better utilize the facilities we have. First of all, we need to rethink, what authorities are we giving FERC and how do they implement them? That would be, step two. And then in thinking about FERC, what needs to be done? I mean, I know a lot of people are talking about small nuclear reactors, and, we can go down that rabbit hole later, but people talk about small nuclear reactors like we're going to build one next year and it's going to solve some problem we have for 2028. Like, that's not really going to happen. But you do have a lot of utilities experimenting with virtual power plant and other kind of battery systems. And again, do we have the regulatory guidance to facilitate that? And like you said, what's state, what's federal? Do we have coordination between state and federal? Are we swimming in opposite directions? One thing I would not like to see that we saw in Trump 1.0, I think we need to move away from viewing everything in a political way. So suing the state of California for innovating would be a bad idea. I think we need to really think about where have we tried different kinds of solutions and where has it worked? And then what does FERC need to do to work with the states to get the regulatory settings we need to make those things effective?
Yeah. Amy, you talked about Constellation and you mentioned SMRs, and I want to ask you about that because I know in our planning call, you had some feelings about where you see SMRs in the whole mix. Can you take us through that? Like, give us your perspective on SMRs and why do you feel they may not be all-encompassing solution for what we may need?
So my whole concern about SMRs is not actually with the technology itself. I think we have some interesting designs that are worth looking at. But my concern is really timeline. We have a problem. I mean, at some point, advanced materials for chips and quantum computing might make the current problem look smaller. And that might be in the same time frame that we can get a first-of-a-kind demonstration on an SMR. So we shouldn't be talking about those two things as if they're completely independent of each other. And we shouldn't talk about SMRs with this hype scale that, we're going to solve this problem with SMRs. Because, there are other things we can do. Hydrogen, for example, as a storage medium could be a solution in some locations. So I like to ask the critical questions. What is the real timeline for high assay, low enriched uranium, HALO fuel? We're talking about HALO fuel in 2030. Is that realistic? Number two, what designs has the NRC actually approved? The answer to that question is not many. And even for the one that's been through the whole process, which is NuScale, they haven't been through the whole process on the larger sizes. So, I got it. There's some others that are a little bit further along, like Kairos, but in the end, that's the first step. The second step is to think about the other thing. Are all the proposed plants, do they all have operators? Do they all have waste plans? what do we actually know about the cost for first of a kind? Are we sure about those costs and how we think they're going to go? No one seems to talk about the fact that we're starting to go to encasing nuclear waste, heavy metal containers, casks now, because we've run out of space in the water ponds. So, there's just a lot of problems that we're glossing over by just saying SMRs like they're going to magically appear and all these other things I'm mentioning aren't an issue. And so that's sort of my perspective, is that I'd like to see the discussion on SMRs go down into the weeds and not be this sort of gloss over thing I'm saying. I think one of the things that I was sharing with someone who was actually with an SMR company, they were asking me, what am I hearing in the finance world? And I said, well, in the finance world, people are looking at retired or aging coal plants that are on a really good site with really nice transmission, large-scale transmission. And could they buy that site under Trump and keep the coal plant operating to have some cash flows, and then be positioned for when SMRs are kind of cleared up and they could commission one to come on their site? So they're not even talking about how they are going to finance SMRs per se right now. I mean, I'm not saying no one is, but it's a long journey.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to require a lot of regulation, a lot of clarity, a lot of finance. Just think of like the supply chain, right? All the equipment that's going to be needed to supply and help run these things. You can't just go to a local store or go on Amazon to buy a lot of the specialized equipment that's going to be needed. Amy, you've written a lot about energy and technology. In fact, your book, Energy's Digital Future, you dived into technology and the technology movement and how we've advanced to some degree, but maybe we're overselling or underselling some of the values. I want to ask you about, and I think it was one of your thesis statements was around, the untapped potential in using digital solutions for demand management. Can you share more about that opportunity or the way you see it? And why do you feel it's under-discussed compared with other technologies?
Well, let's unpack that, because it is a big piece of what I think we could be doing. And remember, if I can shed some load over here, then I can keep my data center on. So, people don't understand what's already happened. When I mentioned, like, I'm sure even some of your listeners, I talk about virtual power plant, for example. So some kind of combination of asking people to join in an aggregated battery system and then donate part of their battery to the utility or to the VPP provider like the Teslas or Sunruns through some kind of software or, contractual agreement. So what's interesting to me about that is just thinking about what have we had that's a success recently when it comes to load problems from weather. Because, we're all talking about the load from data centers, or some people are talking about electric cars, but, it's unpopular to talk about the problems that are coming from extreme weather, but those are perhaps more daunting, and still becomes a matter of national security. I mean, we don't want to have a national security event and we can't deal with it because we had bad weather. So what are we talking about? So I like to use the example of CAISO from 2022. I got heckled one time trying to speak about this at a major convention of electricity cooperatives, from the, I guess, Midwest and Southwest. But then after I went through the actual statistics, everybody smartened up, and then they asked me, actually pertinent questions. So CAISO in 2022 had a typical summer load of 30 megawatt. September 22, that surged based on the heat wave to 50 megawatts. So you're talking about a sudden 60% increase. When I was speaking at this convention, I asked everybody to raise their hand if they thought they were prepared to cope with a sudden 60% increase in load. And of course, no one raised their hand. And I asked if any of them had done a 10-year forward weather forecast, or whether they were all still doing forecasts based on historical weather. I mean, I don't know. There might have been like 800 to 1,000 people there. And rhetorically, and then later in the, reception, they all agreed. No one was doing forward-looking, load projections. So that was, again, a problem. But in the end, on September 6th, CAISO sent out these tweets telling you what to do. And I have to say, I was in California at the time in a rented house. We got the messages because I'm still in the California system, because I lived for a while in California. And it told me what to turn off. And as a result of those flex alerts, they were able to shave 10% of load. On September 6th in particular, they shed 1,200 megawatts, and there was no brownout. The costs were astronomical, though. Wholesale hit $1,200 per megawatt hour. That's versus the normal $100. The September average wasn't as bad, $450. But it was a lesson if we could come up with a system where we're paying people to turn off and doing other things so we don't have all this bidding in the market. If we know we're doing it and it's prepared and the market's structured a certain way, then you might get less of a response in the wholesale price. And in the end, in 2022, batteries contributed 6% of energy supply during peak. Now, why is that significant? Because literally, I know it won't be the day that this podcast airs, but it is today the day we're taping it. Today in ERCOT, batteries hit a record of 8% supply. And they stayed on and provided 2,000 megawatts of power for 2 hours. So they were a critical buffer. And you don't hear people standing up and talking about, let's do batteries. I mean, I guess now that Elon Musk is cheerleader number one for Trump 2.0, maybe we'll hear more about it. But it's not talked about the way people talk about reliability. And yet they're playing a big role and thinking concretely about what is the pricing that's needed to have those batteries play a real substantial part. And, Elon Musk did a lot of reform work lobbying in Texas to be able to put his batteries at, different segments of the electricity value chain. So it's really kind of an interesting thing to think through. And we'd have to get the public there. But you have places like Vermont where they have, now a major, state program. And you have other states that are, kind of looking at the same. We're doing a research project on the state of these sort of aggregated battery projects and some demand management projects that don't involve batteries or solar. And we counted up, based on some other databases that people have put together and we verified, there's over 125 projects now across the United States, which I don't think people understand how big it is. People think it's just Vermont or just PG&E. We're talking about 94 active projects. Some of them are community aggregations, and some of it's Tesla. But you're starting to get some big players. Besides Green Mountain and PG&E and Hawaiian Electric, you got Rocky Mountain, you've got Duke, you've got Eversource. So we're moving forward with that. And it has to be part of the mix. Just saying we're going to do SMRs in 10 years doesn't solve this year's problem. VPPs can be put in unbelievably quickly, and they can be repaired in a storm unbelievably quickly. And so we really need to give that some attention.
Absolutely. It makes sense. The mix of energy sources and how we use it, plus demand management, is all going to need to play a role. Amy, if you don't mind, I want to go back to the geopolitical dimensions of our discussion. And you've written a lot about this. And I mentioned briefly about supply chain, and I want to hear you talk about that. Particularly, components like transformers and other manufactured items that rely on rare earth metals. We're surrounded by global tensions everywhere, unfortunately, and this is playing a role in U.S. policy, U.S. sourcing, the manufacturing, the Buy America. You study this as part of your research. Can you talk about that? Just give us an idea of what your perspective is on this, and just what should we be thinking about as we look at supply chain and supply chain resilience in the next administration.
So let me start with one basic fact. The fact is, one of the first things that Russia bombed when it did its latest incursion into Ukraine was their factory for making transformers. And that resulted in a ripple effect, because that meant that the United States and Europe had to supply, every time the Russians bomb energy infrastructure in Ukraine, the allies have to come up with more transformers and other basic equipment to be reinstalled in Ukraine. And we have to be thinking strategically about what pressure that puts on our own system when it comes to severe weather and other things that, we're talking both large transformers that are system transformers and, the little boxes on my street corner. So the Congress has attempted several times to raise a bill to kind of put transformer manufacturing inside the United States on par with some of the other manufacturing that we've given an assistance to. And they got knocked out of the IRA bill. I'll be sarcastic for a minute. I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but the idea that we're giving a subsidy to people to have an electric bicycle in the city, but we couldn't come up with the funding to help manufacture more transformers when that's a critical linchpin in keeping reliable electricity for our allies who are in war and for ourselves, in our own country. That really irritates me. So I think that's something we need to reconsider. And if you think about vulnerability, when I was living in California, we had this crazy thing. I had to go on TV and talk about it, so I remember it distinctly, because some quote unquote people went and used high-powered rifles to shoot transformers. And it caused this big blackout in Northern California. And later, I don't know, I'm not in the intelligence community, so I can't weigh in, but there was some discussion, unconfirmed, that maybe it was a terrorist attack. And one of the clever things they did is they not only, shot up these transformers, they knocked out 911. So you couldn't even call and say you were in the dark. That's how they got away, because people who heard the explosion and the firing couldn't call 911 because 911 was turned off. So we really need to think very seriously about, are we engaged in the right manufacturing and the right stockpiling when it comes to energy supplies? I get how people in some parts of the country feel about their local commodity that's produced in their state. I lived 25 years in Texas, so I can understand that sentiment. But, and there's the but, the reality is that we know from, say, what happened to hospitals in Puerto Rico or other places, that a company like Tesla can go in with a bunch of solar panels and some batteries and put something back online, at least temporarily, for some power and usage within a week or two. I mean, it doesn't take long to put those systems up. And it might not be a permanent solution, but it's a solution for critical operations. So I actually wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine about how the Pentagon itself should be stockpiling solar panels and batteries for use in national emergencies or even in the war setting. And when we think about it, obviously the Pentagon already stocks some basic metals, so they're probably on that. But thinking about what is it exactly that utilities should be stockpiling, I'm sure many utilities have a backlog of transformers, and maybe because so many people are stockpiling transformers, that's why we have a global shortage in them. I mean, definitely. But it's interesting. I heard an interview with someone from Hitachi where they were saying that, we have it under control. We have these 2 new plants coming on in the United States, blah, blah, blah. And then like 3 days later, I'm picking up the Financial Times newspaper, and the chairman of Hitachi is saying there's a major problem globally. So I don't know. I think, again, I'd like to see, I'm not an expert enough. I just know that it's a problem because of the Ukraine war. And if we don't settle that war and we have continued warfare in other locations like the Middle East, then, that's something that puts things under pressure. And the other thing, just to, sort of highlight to your listeners, because it's probably not on their radar screen, no pun intended, is that Europe has a connected grid across many, many countries, and with some, interesting connections to North Africa and elsewhere. But one of the things that's sort of a function of history that is about to change is that the countries of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were originally in what's called the Brel system, which is sort of a vestige of the former Soviet Union. So they are literally connected to Russia's grid, and they have to give the Russians 6 months' notice to stop being connected to Brel and to fully convert to the CEN European system. And when the Ukrainians did that, they got attacked. Now, I'm not saying that that means that the Baltics are going to get attacked, but it's a stressful situation. The Russians have interfered some with the construction of undersea pipelines to other European countries. And it's a tense situation. And again, it's having us think geopolitically about grids in Europe and grids elsewhere. And what is the U.S. role in defending our allies' electricity systems? Is that material? Is that assistance with cyber protection? Do we have enough cyber protection in this country to make sure that we can have a deterrent effect because we don't have to worry about being attacked back? I don't think we've really thought seriously enough about that question, frankly.
No. All right, so Amy, you've taken us across the world to a whole inventory of challenges and questions that are going to face the next administration. But why don't we take a pause there for a moment, let our listeners take a deep breath. And we're going to shift now to what we call the lightning round, where, Amy, we get an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you, person, rather than you, the professional. So we're going to ask you a series of questions. We ask you to keep your response to one word or phrase. And are you ready?
I am frightened, but ready. Okay, go ahead.
All right, nothing to be afraid of. What's your guilty pleasure snack?
Levain chocolate chip cookies. Love them.
Oh, those are good. What do you think you'd be doing for a career if you didn't end up in energy?
Well, I started out planning to be an international diplomat with the State Department, so maybe if my parents had not refused to give me more money to continue my studies in Arabic in Egypt, I might actually still be a diplomat.
Is there any specific book that's had the greatest impact to your perspective in this field?
You know, hats off to Matt Rogers and Stefan Heck. I love their book, Resource Revolution, and it got me really thinking about the role of technology innovation in the future, and very influential.
Who are your role models?
Okay, first boss. Someone most listeners never heard of, David Mizrahi, was a professional Middle East expert. He had a specialty newsletter, and he taught me that when you get a critique from someone who might know less than you, always answer with a question first. Number 2, James Baker, who I served with under his institute in Houston at Rice University. Mr. Baker taught me, I think, my most important life lesson is that don't respond until you've had time to think through your strategy. Number 3, which is kind of a recent inspiration again, because there's a Netflix special about her. I like, for women, Martha Stewart, and you're saying, well, that sounds crazy. She's baking cookies. But no, my love of chocolate chip cookies notwithstanding, do not make apologies for who you are. That is a motto, and that is why I like her.
We're collecting lightning round questions from past podcast guests to ask future guests. So we have David Schleicher of Novec recently challenged the future guest with the following question. And just to remind you, if you're not familiar with Novec, it's Data Center Alley in Northern Virginia. So he asks, what have you done to pass on the legacy of your knowledge and your experience in this most vital industry to the next generation of leaders? Amy?
Well, I will tell you, the great thing about being a university professor is that it's your job to pass on your legacy. Hats off. You know who you are. I could name a few names if you want me to. My students are my legacy. And I have some very successful students in our field that we're talking about today, some of whom some of you may have heard of. So they are my legacy. You know who you are. Shall I mention some? I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't mention specific students. But I have some really famous students.
Now it's your turn. What lightning round question do you want to challenge a future guest to answer? And it can be topical and related to energy, or it can be an off-the-wall question.
So I would have them answer, what would you tell your 22-year-old self about building a career in energy?
Nice. And lastly, what are you most motivated by?
Well, I'm motivated by the younger generation. I like their first principles thinking. And I think that to solve many of the problems that we have going forward, that it's going to require a different way of thinking about the problem and not our typical way of coming up with small incremental solutions. We really need to be able to think through new ways of solving the same problem with different kinds of technology and different kinds of ways of thinking about society.
Well, those are sound words. And Amy, since you performed so beautifully in the lightning round, we want to give you the last word for today. So knowing that you have decision makers and executives in the power sector and key leaders at utilities listening in, what do you hope is the resounding, lasting message they take away from our conversation today?
Be open to thinking through what you need to use new technologies in a way that is, in your opinion, safe enough. Because to just say that these technologies are too experimental or too first of a kind, or I can't try that, reliability is the most important thing, is not going to be good enough for the challenges we face. And also, we're facing global competitors, China and others who are going to use these technologies, whether we're going to use them or not. So, what do you need to make you comfortable to innovate?
Excellent. And a lot of what you're talking about here is also in your most recent book. So we'll make sure we'll have that book title in the show notes for anyone who wants to read up more. So Amy, I want to thank you very much for, being a great sport on the show today. You've answered all the questions we've thrown at you, and you've taken us across the world. So Amy, again, thank you for joining us in today's episode of the podcast.
Jason, thanks for having me.
Oh, you bet. You can always reach Amy through the platform, the Energy Central platform, where she welcomes your questions and comments. And we also want to give a shout out of thanks to the podcast sponsors that made today's episode possible. Thanks to West Monroe. West Monroe is the leading partner for the nation's largest electric, gas, and water utilities, working together to drive grid modernization, clean energy, and workforce transformation. West Monroe's comprehensive services are designed to support utilities in advancing their digital transformation, building resilient operations, securing federal funding, and providing regulatory advisory support. With a multidisciplinary team of experts, West Monroe offers a holistic approach that addresses the challenges of the grid today and provides innovative solutions for a sustainable future. Once again, I'm your host, Jason Price. Plug in and stay fully charged in the discussion by hopping into the community at energycentral.com, and we'll see you next time at the Energy Central Power Perspectives podcast.